The next one, we are actually going to jump into the presentations. And lucky for you, it's another American. Oh, yay, right? Just bring them all over now that they can leave their houses. So without further ado, please help me welcome Professor Woody Hartzog. Woody is going to present on the GDPR's failure and privacy's best path forward. So, Woody, I'm going to open your presentation, and then you can come up here and present away. Clap, clap. Yay, everybody clap. There you go. Here's a clicker for you.
Excellent. Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome.
I really appreciate it. It's great to see all of you. Thanks so much. Everyone can hear me okay? I'm not too loud or too quiet? Excellent. Many thanks to Munir Masoud and everyone at ISACA Sweden for having me today. So I know what you may be thinking right about now, which is, oh boy, another GDPR talk. And if you're close to my line of work, then you've been hearing about the GDPR now for a relatively steady amount of time. And it's true. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. Many of you likely have had a fair amount of experience with the GDPR. I don't come here to bury the GDPR. As you'll see, I think it is necessary but not sufficient. But I don't come here to praise it either, actually. While failure is in the title of the talk, the GDPR's failure, before I start talking about where we went wrong, I do want to take a second and recognize what I think the GDPR has done well. So a little background about me. I'm a law professor in the United States at Northeastern University in Boston. I teach courses in information privacy law and data protection and data compliance. And certainly, it has become clear that the GDPR has had a good impact in several different ways. As DPAs get bolder with their actions, opportunities for meaningful accountability have certainly increased. This is particularly true, I think, as DPAs embrace the most robust and protective interpretations of really important concepts like data minimization, purpose limitation, and legitimate interests. I have had a lot of conversations with privacy professionals around the world, and one thing that has really become clear is that the GDPR has, in fact, really caused a lot of change within organizations. It has changed the structure, giving privacy professionals and data protection professionals more power, more resources than they have had before, which I think is worth recognizing. It has also changed practices. I think that the GDPR has meaningfully helped improve data mapping practices across the board throughout organizations. And finally, I'll give the GDPR this. So privacy used to not be front page news. I had difficulty actually explaining to my parents what I wrote about and talked about for a long time, and some of you may have experienced this as well. And so for years, I tried to explain to them. And then somewhere around 2018, the emails started piling in. And many of you probably recognize this as well. Well, we've changed our terms of service, and things started happening, and there's all this buzz. The GDPR had made privacy and data protection front page news on multiple fronts, which I really appreciate. And so I think that is worth recognizing before I spend the rest of my talk telling you perhaps where I think we could improve. We have a long way to go. I am here to say today, to kick off our conversations, that the GDPR in its current state is nowhere close to being strong enough to counter the incomprehensible power of technology companies and other companies that collect and process our personal information, and the threat that this processing poses to our privacy, our society, and our well-being. Surveillance capitalism, the abusive and corrosive extraction of our personal information for financial gain, is continuing almost unabated in spite of the GDPR. There are now more sensors creating more data for more companies, creating more risks than ever before in the history of the world. The GDPR is the most robust data protection framework in the world, and even it is not enough. So where did the GDPR fall short? I argue that the GDPR has three major shortcomings that cause it to fail in fully protecting our privacy and other aspects of our well-being that are jeopardized by the collection, processing, and sharing of our personal information. One, it only applies to personal data. Two, it lionizes, giving people control over their personal information at the expense of other important values. And three, it is focused on the individual to a fault. Now let me explain what I mean by all three of those. So first, it may sound a little strange, but protecting data privacy means more, in my opinion, than just protecting personal data. And let me explain what I mean by that. So if there's anything that we can all agree on in the world of data protection, is that it's all about the data, right? Who's collecting the data? How is it being processed? Who is it being shared with? Under what circumstances? What is the basis for the data? The data is, in fact, the center of it all. We have an entire fundamental right within the EU concerning the artifact of data, which makes sense because data is exceptional in terms of information. It makes it easy to store information in a perfected state that doesn't degrade over time. It's easy to aggregate. It's easy to search and recall, and it's easy to share. And because of those affordances, it is worth singling out, right? But our modern privacy predicament involving information, as we consider it, means that we have to consider more than just the concept of data. One of the virtues of the GDPR, of course, is that it follows the data wherever it flows, right? Regardless of the relationship between the parties that are sharing that information, that is truly one of the virtues of it. However, relationships between individuals and organizations and between organizations are critical for our privacy because they are characterized often and typically by extreme power asymmetries. Companies have remarkable amounts of power over individuals. They know better than us, than we will ever know, the risks of processing personal data. Companies entirely control the terms of the relationship and the choices we make using these inferences because they created the framework by which we make choices. And no amount of data subject rights that people struggle to take advantage of anyway are going to change those major power asymmetries. So it's about relationships of trust, which unfortunately our GDPR and other major data protection frameworks are actually largely agnostic to. It's also about the concept of design. In my book, Privacy's Blueprint, I argue that design is everything. And what I mean by that is that design is everywhere, design is power, and design is political. Design is everywhere because every single place you look, someone has made a choice to construct an artifact in a particular kind of way that influences our behavior. And once you start looking for it, you see it all over the place. You see it on the location of buttons. You see it on the ways in which our screens are built. You see it in the ways in which hallways navigate our behavior or facilitate, for example, bikes and cars on the road. Design is all over the place. And when I started writing the book, I started noticing it everywhere. But design is also power. Every single design decision for a technology, a thing that is meant to affect our world, makes a certain reality more or less likely, right? It doesn't dictate what's going to happen, but it nudges it. It flows it along particular directions. And because of that, the designer has an incredible amount of power to change the future. And that is why design is political. When I first started writing about design and proposing rules for design in my book, I got a lot of pushback, and they said we shouldn't be regulating the design of technologies because a lot of these technologies are sort of neutral platforms, right? You shouldn't be regulating neutral platforms. But I argue that there is no such thing as a neutral technology. A technology by design is meant to act into our worlds, and so every single choice about that technology makes a certain reality more or less likely. And because of that, nothing is value neutral. Even the things we choose to ignore are choices about realities that designers want to see in the world, right? Okay. So that was one. Two, it's not just about the data, but it's also not about control over personal information. And this is where we get into a little bit of controversial territory. Why? Because the EU Fundamental Right for Data Protection is premised on the idea of informational self-determination, the idea that we should get to decide for ourselves how our information is used, who has it, who we can share with it, right? This is fundamentally ingrained, not just within the EU, but in data protection regimes around the world. And it started with the Fair Information Practices in the 1970s. When databases were relatively new, somehow we all got together and decided that the way in which we fairly process this data is to give people control over their personal information, right? Made sense perhaps at the time. There were some dangers, lots of different choices about what we can do with personal information. We want to protect people's autonomy. This is a good thing. This is a thing that we value. But that was 50 years ago. More than 50 years ago, a time of network television, rotary dial phones, and slow computers that filled entire rooms. Now we have new problems, right, that really were difficult to contemplate when the first databases first started to get created. But the problem is that we tend to keep holding on to this idea of control over personal information in our data protection frameworks, particularly within the GDPR, as though it were the only thing that matters. But I think it's the wrong goal for a few different reasons. One, control is illusory. It's a shell game. Because the control we are given online is mediated, which means it cannot be helped but engineered to produce particular results, right? The realities of technology at scale mean that the services we use must be built in a way that constrains our choices, right? Could you imagine the chaos that would ensue if we had real control over our personal information? How would we effectuate that? Well, we'd put a little text box that everyone could write into. Dear Google, I would like for you to only collect 3 pieces of personal information and only share it with my mom and Netflix, period. Boom, done, right? If we had that, we would have control over information. That's chaos. There's no way that that would scale, right? And so companies would never get off the ground. Instead, we have boxes to check, buttons to press, switches to activate and deactivate, and lots of other settings that we get to fiddle with. So our mediated perception of control obscures the fact that design funnels our behavior. People can only click the options that are provided to them in advance. We give this sort of fake control all the time for things like when we're dealing with kids, right? So when I talk to my kids about what we're going to do on a Saturday, I say, do you want to go to the park or do you want to go to the movies, right? And they're given a choice and they feel like their autonomy has been respected and emboldened. But what choice they didn't get was whether we're going to go to the pet store and get a dog, because I've been putting off that conversation for years now, right, by giving them a series of choices that make them feel like they have choice, but actually the real choice I didn't want them to make is, of course, never presented to them in the first place. Many of you have probably experienced something along these lines. Design sort of nudges us by sending us signals and making tasks easier or harder to encourage, and cause us to act in predictable ways. Companies deploy dark patterns to exploit our built-in tendencies to prefer shiny, colorful buttons and ignore dull, gray ones, or shame us into feeling bad about withholding data or declining options, or simply making exercising control possible but costly through forced work, subtle misdirection, and incentive tethering. I love this one because it's like, you can either install this or you can get details about how we're going to make you install this eventually, right? There is no option for don't install it. Or you get things like this, which is an example of what UX UI designer Harry Brignall, who coined the term dark patterns, is called confirm shaming, right? Which we laugh at it now. It's right, like I don't want notifications. So you either allow them in this beautiful blue button, which makes you want to press it, right? Or you get the grayscale link that literally makes you click, no, I prefer to bleed to death, right? Now, of course, we laugh at that. Many of us may not be affected by that. But here's the thing. At scale, these sorts of interventions are effective. Right? They do make differences at the margins. Or we have things where we get sort of wheedled into oversharing simply through the design of online services. Not only is sharing meant to make us feel good, like keep a streak going on Snapchat, or it nudges us into share old posts, right? Like 5 years ago on Facebook, and you should share more posts. Or congratulate others. The reason why is because services often make it so easy for us to share our personal information. The key to keeping the data spigot flowing is to get people to want to say yes and require the least amount of effort for them to impulsively do so. Desire has a powerful tendency to dampen skepticism. If we users want it bad enough, we can rationalize almost any decision to expose ourselves. Of course, these choices aren't always harmful for us. Many of them might be quite useful. But asking companies that engineer user control paves the way for abuse and self-dealing at the margins. The third reason that I think control is the wrong goal for data protection is because it is overwhelming at scale. So in talking with lawmakers, I speak with lawmakers a fair bit about ways to improve our privacy rules. And almost always it feels like the answer is we should just give it more control, right? There's almost no problem that in the world of privacy and data protection that lawmakers feel like they can't solve just by chucking a whole more box of control on top of it, right? It's for those that have seen Spinal Tap. It's like you just turn the control knob up to 11, and that's going to be how you do it. And it sounds great, right? Control is attractive in isolation. Who doesn't want more control over their personal information? But with this power, right, with this grant of control, often comes a practical obligation. If you don't exercise the control you are given, you are at risk, and companies can take your inaction as acquiescence. So while you might remember to adjust your privacy settings on Facebook, what about Instagram, Twitter, Google, Amazon, Netflix, Snapchat, Siri, Cortana, Fitbit, Candy Crush, your smart TV, your robot vacuum cleaner, your Wi-Fi connected car, and your child's Hello Barbie, right? Mobile apps can ask users for over 200 permissions, and even the average app asks for 5. The problem with thinking about control over personal information is that in mediated environments, control looks like this, right? Which seems good. This is easy. Do you want to collect geolocation? Green means yes. Gray means no. Sure. Done. Right? I love it. The problem, of course, is that it's never just this. Right? We have a series of choices to make. Okay, compass calibration. That seems like a good thing. Find my iPad, definitely. Location-based alerts, maybe? I don't know, location-based ads, no, right? And so we take a few minutes and we fiddle with our settings and we say, okay, now I feel good about this, right? All of you who logged into the hotel Wi-Fi probably were asked yet again, maybe for the 10th time today, about cookie settings, right? Yes, no, only essential cookies manage my settings, right? And so we pour our cup of coffee in the morning and we fiddle with our settings and we say, okay, I think I've got it right. Control has been given to me. Control has been exercised. My privacy is protected and I feel good. And then we sit back and we say, oh dear, we've got a lot of work to do, right? The problem with thinking about privacy as control over personal information is that if you get your wish for more privacy, you get so much control that you choke on it, right? Another reason why I think control is the wrong goal for information privacy is that it's myopic. Notions of individual control don't really fit well with privacy as a collective value. Why would we think that the collective wisdom of billions of self-motivated decisions is a good idea anyway, right? Scholars have shown that privacy preferences are uncertain, contextually dependent, and incredibly malleable, right? The availability of knowledge doesn't necessarily translate into meaningfully informed decisions. Lawmakers often favor things like mandated disclosures, like warning on cigarette boxes, because they're cheap and that they ostensibly counter information disparities. Right? But the reality is that companies know a lot more than people do regarding the wisdom of a decision. And in this context, users are being asked to consider the privacy of implications of the implications of each post that they create. Right? This is an impossibly complex calculation for people to make regularly regarding the risk of consequences, the risks and consequences of their decisions. Finally, there's just more at stake with our data than simply informational self-determination. FIPS regimes like the GDPR conceive of fair data processing as an eternally virtuous goal, which has the consequence of normalizing data processing and surveillance and procedural rules at the cost of more substantive protections. Data protection regimes also fail to account for data externalities, things like environmental harm, attention theft, and degradation of social interaction. This is a problem because we are only just now beginning to see the human and societal costs of the massive scale of data processing and platform dominance. So, phenomena like fake news, deepfakes, non-consensual pornography, harassment, sharenting, addiction by design, and lives spent staring bleakly into phones are at least partially byproducts or made worse by the human data industrial complex. This is to say nothing of the toll inflicted on our natural environment. We need broader frameworks simply than the GDPR, not just because data is personal to us, but because the incentive to exploit personal data creeps into nearly every aspect of our technologically mediated lives. For example, data protection regimes do very little to mitigate many of the problems that arise because of the fact that technologies are designed to be addictive, to maximize interaction and data collection. Our phones and computers are designed this way because tech companies have powerful incentives to make sure that you never put down your phone or log off of your computer. The data spigot has to keep flowing, and it is ruining us. Our addiction to technology is harming our mental well-being, our social relationships, and the very nature of what it means to be human in our modern world. The average person spends 4 hours staring at their phone every day. Our compulsive use of technology is wreaking havoc on our emotional and our mental well-being, particularly for young people. There's a growing consensus that screen time adversely affects the healthy development of small children. And all of this is at least partially, but significantly driven by the optimization of user interfaces that are meant to keep us clicking and scrolling and sharing our personal information. The internet also makes speaking and exposing ourselves very easy and anonymous in a quest for more engagement, for more data, for more interaction. And by doing so, meaning that it's so easy and costless to share, we do it with very little reflection. And when speech becomes costless and consequence-free through anonymity and harassment and bile, that usually follows. And so we need a much better approach because our information ecosystem is slowly getting polluted in the aggregate. Our ability to tell truth from falsity is getting polluted because it is so easy, because there are algorithms that prioritize the most extreme viewpoints, right, regardless of their truth or veracity. And so in an attempt to drive this sort of more data, more personal information, we are slowly corroding our sense and our ability to engage in self-governance. Also, one of the I think, drawbacks of focusing on frameworks that are largely procedural, that mean to actually enable the broad sharing of personal information, is that we slowly sort of normalize the concept of surveillance. And so in the United States, there are a lot of rules that we have that focus on user expectations, right? What did you expect, right? We set our privacy rules based on the idea, like if you are upset about something, right, if it sort of rises to the level of causing someone to be surprised or upset, then we say that's bad, right? If people should be able to have the language we use is a reasonable expectation of privacy. The problem with setting the bar at a reasonable expectation of privacy is that we look for things that sort of jolt us, right? Large lurches, specific large privacy violations that really sort of move the needle, right? And we say, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't collect all this information in mass, right? You caused a great harm here, or emotional damage or financial harm. But what we ignore are the small little cuts, right? I call them privacy nicks. The small little cuts that slowly start to erode our sense of being watched, right? We use words like creepy to describe these things, but I don't like that. It feels sort of creepy, right? The first time you notice a surveillance camera, maybe you say, oh, that's sort of creepy. I don't like that, right? And then we go about our day. And slowly but surely and inevitably, the finish line, right, for what we would constitute as a privacy violation gets moved back just a little more and a little more and a little more, right? And when we have procedural rules with no firm backstop, there's nothing to stop the inevitable normalization of all surveillance practices, right? This is what happens when we premise everything on things like consent or control over personal information. Because then the law of privacy becomes the law of whatever we can get you to agree to. And if we become normalized to things, and if things become acclimated, right, then we're more likely to agree to them. And the finish line keeps getting moved further and further back. Another reason why I think the GDPR is relatively limited is that traditional data frameworks like the GDPR are focused on the data of each individual. But they're so focused on the individual, they overlook important societal and the civil rights implications of collecting and processing personal data. Marginalized communities, particularly communities of color, shoulder a disproportionate burden from privacy abuses. We should embrace a more collective approach rather than a highly individualistic approach. And the reason why is because if we focus only on the individual and the collective wisdom of millions, if not billions, of individual decisions, then we're essentially taking as the status quo, right, whatever our threshold is, the collective wisdom about what's the worst that would happen to me when I say yes to this information, right? When you agree to allow cookies, right, as part of the EU data directive, I realize that's not the GDPR. But when you agree to sort of allow tracking cookies, do you think, how could my information be used to harm other people? Probably not, right? Most of the time, and all of our systems are built to make us ask, what's the worst that's going to happen to me individually? But of course, that's not how our system works anymore. Data that is collected by me, right, or collected about me, can be used to train AI models that then are used to harm others, right? But we don't take that into our collective sort of decision-making process. And so it doesn't get reflected in the output, right? This is what happens when we sort of very strongly focus on the individual at the expense of the collective. Okay, so maybe at this point you're saying, all right, smart guy, if the GDPR is not the answer, then what is the answer? I have argued, along with a co-author of mine, Neil Richards, that we need a more holistic approach to privacy because we're still in a key moment for the regulation of data protection and privacy around the world. Yes, the GDPR has largely been set in stone. No, we fundamentally can't change its entire nature, right? That would be hard, but as all of you are likely aware, we still have the proposed AI regulation. We still have regulation on things like data trusts. And so there is room, I think, to fundamentally change the direction of where we're headed. This is not like property law, which hasn't changed in 250 years, right? I tell my students that there's just not a lot that's sort of changed there. And so we're still in a time where we can effectuate what I would argue would be meaningful change. And instead of just focusing on the data, so I said, what are the sort of inherent limitations of the GDPR? And one of them was that it only focuses on data. But there's a lot more that we can do, and there's a lot more that lawmakers can focus on and industry can focus on, I think, in order to better protect our privacy and our well-being with respect to our personal data. And it involves 4 different things, which I can explain a little more about. So the first is sort of corporate matters, right? This is structural rules. These are things that include structural questions regarding corporate form, whether executives will be held accountable for certain things. These are taxation questions. These are things like corporate licensing, registration issues. This is also where I envision competition law. So I do know that there has been some recent activity on the markets within the EU. This is where that lies, right? And I think that it's an important key part of the puzzle. I do recognize that part of the critique that I'm asking here is of the GDPR is perhaps I'm asking it to do more than it was originally envisioned to do, which can be handled in other areas. And I think that corporate structure is an important way to do that. Another one is we could actually modify the GDPR, or at least as part of the AI regulation or some other way, to focus on relationships of trust. So I think that our privacy rules would be significantly emboldened if they were more sensitive to the extreme power imbalances that people have with respect to companies, right? Companies that are so good at knowing what we are, it feels as though they're spying on us, but they're not, right? So I tell my students, I have students who come to me and say, I think that my Amazon Alexa is spying on me, right? Because I mentioned something, and then the next day I got an ad for the thing that I was just talking about. And I say, it's probably not that. It's probably simply that recommendation algorithms are so good that it feels like they're spying on you, right? But they're not. It's just very good at that, right? Because companies have all the power with respect to information. They also completely control the terms of our relationship with them, with terms of use agreements, but also with the choices, the boxes that they present to us that we get to pick X, Y, or Z, or scroll down and pick. And so when that is the case, the law actually already, across the world, has a built-in sense of how to protect those relationships of great vulnerability, of extreme power differentials. It's called the law of fiduciaries. When you trust your doctor with sensitive personal information, when you trust your accountant with every financial decision that you've made, the law recognizes that there should be duties of loyalty and care and confidentiality so that they don't abuse that information and use it in a way that's adverse to your interests because you are at such a vulnerability to them. And we've already started to explore this. So the Data Governance Act in the EU has already been proposed that is looking at things like data loyalty, the concept of data trusts. But I think we should build that out even more. We should build that into the very fabric of the relationships between us and those who collect our personal information. And I think that that would actually go a long way in helping shore up some of the limitations of the GDPR. Now, of course, I also, and this is the part where I say we still need data protection frameworks. It's a good idea to have the GDPR, and certainly the GDPR is the best example that I've seen around the world in terms of data protection frameworks. Regardless of the nature between the parties, data flows, and we need good frameworks to govern that flow. And then the final tier of laws that I suggest as part of this overall framework targets external consequences. The external costs, or I guess what an economist would call an externality, imposed on society by the personal data industrial complex, things that would include perhaps environmental protection and certainly corrosion of democratic self-governance, but also our overall reduced well-being through the hijacking of our attention and our time. This is also the place to implement mechanisms that would be more sensitive to things like the normalization and acclimation of surveillance that gradually but inevitably lead us to further continually renegotiate our expectations of privacy in society. So, in conclusion, I argue that the GDPR is necessary but far from sufficient to confront the incredible power of that comes from the scale of data processing that we're experiencing right now. Instead, we should embrace frameworks that recognize that protecting privacy requires more than just protecting data, that we actually also need to protect people as well. All right. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to go into Q&A and answer any questions that you have now.